用声音
碰撞世界，
生动活泼。
嗨，大家好呀，我是科技早知道的节目监制刘灿。今年9月，麻省理工科技评论报道，亚马逊创始人贝佐斯已于近期投资了专注于抗衰方向的生物科技公司 Altos Labs。这是一家今年4月才成立的，致力于推动重编程技术的抗衰老公司。科研团队包括2012年诺贝尔奖获得者、诱导性多功能干细胞知名研究学者山中伸弥。在尚未有任何产品诞生的情况下， Altos Labs 在今年的上半年已经吸引了至少 2.7 亿美元的投资。投资者的名单还有另外一位硅谷的亿万富豪尤里米尔纳。事实上，这已经不是硅谷富豪们第一次入局抗衰领域了。早在2018年，贝佐斯就和时任陪跑的联合创始人彼得·蒂尔共同投资了 Unity Biotechnology。这是一家最早实现靶向清除衰老细胞药物商业化落地，并在2018年成功上市的公司。如果我们要继续追溯硅谷富豪投身抗衰老领域的故事，其实还可以从2013年谷歌创始人拉里·佩奇宣布10亿美元投资 Calico 启动抗衰研究项目开始讲起。我们有理由相信，在颠覆互联网、物流制造、航空航天等领域之后，硅谷的下一个目标就是通过生物工程技术实现人类长生不老的梦想。本期节目，我们邀请到了同样在抗衰领域被视为明星公司的硅谷新贵 Gordian 的首席科学官 Martin Borch Jensen。Martin 曾在硅谷湾区知名的巴克衰老研究所从事衰老领域的研究工作。他和主播导演一起讨论了硅谷富豪们投资 Altos Labs 等生物科技公司背后的原因是什么，他们在关注哪些技术，又将向哪些方向继续发展，这些技术最终将通过什么途径实现商业化落地。最重要的是，人类真的可以突破目前120岁左右的寿命上限，实现想活多久就活多久这样听起来不可思议的目标吗？由于本期节目是英文节目，这里我先为大家总结一下本期节目的精彩亮点，希望这能够帮助大家更好地理解本期内容。节目中 Martin 首先介绍了衰老领域的研究发展历程。他从科学家 Tom Johnson 80年代通过对蠕虫基因的研究所绘制出的人类历史上第一个长寿基因图谱开始讲起，论述了衰老是如何在短短近20多年成为一门单独的学科。他强调，由于衰老涵盖多种疾病和技术领域，目前的头部抗衰公司主要都是各自专注在干预或者是治疗与衰老密切相关的一些疾病，就比如阿尔茨海默症、眼病、关节炎、糖尿病、癌症等等。这个赛道受到大家关注的玩家，除了近期大热的 Altos Labs， 还有老牌的明星公司，比如 Unity Biotechnology 和 Calico， 以及 AI 驱动的 In Silico Medicine，还有平台型的初创公司，比如 Gordian 和 Zero State Alpha。当答案问起主流的抗衰技术都有哪些时， Martin 介绍到，目前有常见于免疫治疗的雷帕霉素靶蛋白抑制剂，也就是 mTOR 抑制剂，和常见于糖尿病防控的二甲双胍靶向抗衰老治疗技术，俗称 TAME， 在抗衰领域里面用的比较多。当然，随着更多的抗衰领域的新发现，包括干细胞重编程技术、靶向杀伤衰老细胞的小分子药物 Senolytics， 也逐渐受到了研究人员和投资机构的更多关注。就目前已经面世的抗衰药品而言， Martin 提醒我们到，像 Elysium Health 所推出的 Basis 这种产品更多是定位于 NAD+、NMN 类的膳食营养补充剂，它是没有经过 FDA 的药物监管流程，所以产品的抗衰效果其实有待长期观察。在讨论这一波的投资热潮时， Martin 也提到他的观察，他认为不仅仅是富豪们的家族信托基金对长寿抗衰领域表现出了极大的热情，还有像 Longevity Vision Fund 这种长期的专注于抗衰领域的细分 VC， 以及 Andreessen Horowitz、Arch VC 这种头部的风险投资人和投资机构都对长寿抗衰领域表现出了极大的参与热情。当被问到如何去看待这个赛道的超长投资周期时， Martin 认为，虽然这个领域大部分的投资要等到产品面世后才能够获得回报，但一般来说，只要实验进入到2期或者3期的临床试验阶段， 早期的风险投资者就可以看到比较好的投资回报了。Martin 也认为，目前二级市场上 Unity、Cobar、AGX 这种抗衰老的概念的公司之所以出现股价低迷的状况，是因为二级市场的投资者他更关注药物实验失败对公司收入的负面影响。但其实药物在2期或者是3期的临床实验中出现失败是很常见的状况。当然了 Martin 也提到，为了规避单一药物研发失败所带来的商业风险，像 Gordian 这样关注抗衰技术整体路径优化和成本控制的平台型公司，在商业模式上确实会给投资者争取到更低的边际风险。在探讨到素有硅谷最神秘的生物科技公司 Calico 的发展前景时， Martin 认为各家公司在基础技术上的研究是共通的，主要是看谁能够更好更早的把产品落地。事实上 Martin 提到，目前抗衰领域最大的挑战就是弄清楚衰老的机制，理解具有衰老表征的疾病和衰老本身的因果关系是一项浩大的工程。如果能够发现更多的衰老标志物，研究人员就可以加速生物衰老领域的量化研究能力，真正意义上及时有效地干预衰老的过程。因此像 Gordian 这样的公司就设立了自己的研究奖学金项目，鼓励更多学者关注衰老标志物。如果收听我们节目的小伙伴中有人正在这个领域工作，也欢迎大家踊跃尝试。申请的链接我们已经放在了本期的 show notes。 节目的最后，打算邀请 Martin 分享一些个人的养生秘诀。 Martin 非常真诚地表示，只要规律作息、健康饮食、戒烟戒酒、加强锻炼，我们每个人都可以做到离长寿更进一步。当然他也提到了间歇性断食这种方法，不过这个呢因人而异，如果有收听节目的小伙伴想要尝试，记得先咨询医生哦。除此之外，在本期节目中大家还会听到，拥有巴克研究所的西海岸是否比东海岸在生物技术领域上更高一筹，长生不老药 Elysium 的 Basis 试用测评到底好还是不好，以及 BioViVa 的 CEO 伊丽莎白帕什在自己身上尝试抗衰药剂这样的极端例子在业界是否常见等等有趣的讨论。另外呢，在上一期邀请 Tiger Graph 的惠松讨论图数据库的节目播出后，也有小伙伴在评论区提到他们对图数据库的概念和案例还有很多想进一步了解的地方。10月20日 Tiger Graph 牵头举办的 Graph 加 AI 2021中国线上峰会，或许能够给大家带来更多的启发。大会的报名链接可以在上期的 show notes 里找到，有需要的小伙伴记得及时点击链接报名参与哦。好的，我的介绍就到这里了，接下来就请大家在达燕和 Martin 的交谈中一起探索长生不老药的真实面貌吧。
Hello， 大家好，我是丁教，欢迎收听全新一集 What's Next 科技早知道。Lately, Bezos invests in anti-aging company called Altos Labs, a company that is pursuing biological reprogramming technology, a way to rejuvenate cells. Actually, it is not the first time Bezos invests in anti-aging tech companies. Tech billionaire has a long tradition investing in anti-aging drugs, tech, supplement, or even hacks. Where are we in terms of the understanding the cause of aging and when we can expect to see some breakthrough? Today, our guest is Martin Borch Jensen, CSO at Gordian Biotechnology, which is the first vivo therapeutic screening platform to improve drug development for complex disease of aging. Before co-founded Gordian, he is postdoc and K99 fellow at the Buck Institute for Research on Aging. Hi, Martin. Welcome.
Hi, Dan. Great to be here.
So maybe give a little bit about what does Gordian do?
Basically, what Gordian has invented since we started a couple of years ago is a way to put many drugs into one living animal and test whether any of them do what you want, whether they prevent disease or reverse aging. And the reason this is important for biology of aging is that aging, and we'll get into this in the show, but aging isn't like one thing one clock that's ticking down in all your cells and we know exactly what it is. It's kind of a complex thing that happens within your organism, between the different parts of your organism. And so the only way to really know whether something works in the context of aging is to be inside of a living animal. So that's why we invented that technology.
So it's like a cocktail that inject into the animal, right?
Yeah, but with the ability, so, some people will put, 3 different drugs in to try and treat something. But they can't tell whether one or all of those are working together or individually. So what Gordian has is that we can put many therapies in, and individual cells inside of that animal, we can tell which therapy that cell got and whether it was working. And so we can test hundreds of different therapies independently inside of the same animal, instead of getting just like a big smoothie mix-up of all the effects of the different drugs.
I know you have a background, you got a fellowship at the Bug Institute. So maybe a lot of people, they don't know about Bug Institute. It's kind of like a prestige research institute for aging, right?
Yeah, that's right. In the US, I would say this is the main research institute for aging. It's located just north of San Francisco, and there's, I think, 250 researchers, something like that, with labs focused on various different kinds of aging, from neurodegeneration to reproductive aging to specific mechanisms like senescent cells. So I did my postdoc there, and before that I did my PhD at the main government research center for aging, which is the National Institute on Aging, part of the National Institutes of Health in the US.
Is it a private one or is it a government-funded one?
Yeah, so it's named after the initial donor who paid for this big building. It's almost literally an ivory tower. It's a big white building on top of a hill, designed by I.M. Pei. There was an initial donor, the Buck family, and since then they are supported both by grants from the government, like, all the other research universities, as well as from various private donors.
Is there anything that's kind of on the market already, or still like how long has been this institute existence?
It started, I believe, in 1999, although then they had to build the building. So it's about 2 decades old. But it is a basic research institute. So the goal there is to understand aging and to generate knowledge around aging. However, there are several companies that have spun out of the Buck. Most well-known probably is Unity Biotechnology.
Wow, Unity is from there, huh? Interesting.
From the Buck and from Mayo Clinic. One of the scientific founders, Judy Campisi, is at the Buck. And it was actually, the company was physically inside of the Buck Institute, renting space there until they moved to South San Francisco. And then more recently, I think Napa Therapeutics and B&B Therapeutics and Geostate Alpha. And I think that's it in terms of spin-outs.
So the other day I was talking to your co-founder, Francisco. It is kind of weird because normally when you think about biotech companies, they're mostly in Boston, like East Coast. And all the anti-aging company is in the Bay Area, like a lot of them. Is that because the Buck Institute?
I don't think that's the only reason. The West Coast tends to be more adventurous, let's say.
Okay.
Right? Like there's a reason that the people who want to go to Mars aren't launching from Boston. It's like in California, right?
Right.
And the people who build AI and robots and all these things. So Boston is definitely a big biotech hub, but it's maybe a little bit less sort of frontier. And I think the aging longevity definitely falls into that category of biotech research. So that's my guess. Although I do think that the Buck probably played a role in creating a big hub here for longevity research. And I would say, yeah, San Francisco is probably in the US, the top hub for longevity research.
That's cool because it's just been a domain that's not been very hot for the past few years because it's been in like robots, right? Like AIs, like Bitcoins, like cryptos. Those kind of domains are always like hot on the front of the newspaper, but not anti-aging. But yeah, I didn't know that.
Well, the problem with aging research is that you're trying to make things live longer. So the experiments kind of take a long time. So it's not as fast as, doing stuff on a computer. But it's been growing. I mean, certainly I've been in the field a bit over 10 years. When I first joined, it was not like a normal topic. Like people didn't really know what you were talking about. At this point, there is a lot of interest. You mentioned Altos earlier, obviously Calico. There are a couple of other organizations that are starting up now with like very large budgets. So it's becoming more and more of a mainstream thing.
Like, why is that? It's just because like few billionaires, they just have their personal interest in this and then they pour money in. Like, why is that? Or some tech that kind of like just have some breakthrough. That's why we're here.
I think it's because stuff works. I mean, I don't mean stuff works as in like I have a drug that I can sell you and it'll extend your lifespan. Like we're not there yet. But in animal models, we have a lot of different ways to make them live longer and prevent disease. And that is relatively recent. The first, before, let's say in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, it was kind of, people were talking about aging. They've been talking about aging for thousands of years, but nobody knew anything. People didn't know, there's a big problems of the field paper that I read from 1970 or something like that. And the one question was, are there any genetic changes that make you age slower? That wasn't known. And then in the late 90s, two different labs, Tom Johnson and subsequently Cynthia Kenyon, identified mutations in this worm species that's often used in lab experiments that made them live basically twice as long as normal. And so, that was a fundamental discovery for the aging field, but it wasn't well known by any means. And there was no aging field. So not that many people were paying attention. But before that, we didn't even know that you could extend lifespan, right? Then since then, it's been kind of a steady trickle from a little bit in the 90s and then more in the 2000s, where we found different ways where kind of modulate the rate of aging in animal models. And that's just, it got more and more robust. And now it's getting noticed that, that's actually a thing you can do. And when you think about it, that's it's totally crazy. If you could double the lifespan or even add 50% of healthy lifespan to an organism like a human. We can't do that yet, but the equivalent would be something like the elves of Tolkien or something like that, right? Just these totally different creatures that have a totally different perspective on life. So when you think about the possibility the rate of aging can be changed, that starts to be kind of a big deal. And I think that people like Bezos and various others are getting interested in it because it is such a big deal. The only reason it hasn't been a big deal before is it's been a snake oil sort of area for a really long time, right? I mean, we've had quote unquote aging cures for thousands of years.
Right.
There were, I think the first emperor of China supposedly was peddled quicksilver by his anti-aging people, right?
Right.
Qin Shi Huang. So it's been an area where people have been promising things for a really, really long time, and there's been zero delivery. And so I think the first things that in the last couple of decades started to have any real effect were overlooked for a bit, and now they're getting attention.
It's we're starting to find out some scientific proof that something might work. I know my husband I think that was 3 or 4 years ago when Elysium just came out. Mm-hmm. And then he had a subscription of Elysium. And then I asked him, why did you stop? Why, did you feel anything after taking it? He's like, no, I don't feel anything. You're not supposed to feel anything after taking it. It's how do you know that it's going to work? But it's you can't.
Exactly. And it's tough for, there's two problems for a company like Elysium. One of them is that the supposed benefits are going to be decades from now, right? So humans aren't really mentally geared to that degree of delayed gratification. And of course, there's some uncertainty. You don't know if it works and you won't know for a long time. And so it's hard to maintain enthusiasm to keep doing something. I mean, certainly to do a diet or something, eating a pill is easier. And then the other problem for a company like Elysium is that they are selling a product that is not going through FDA approval. And so that means that it's not that regulated, what they're allowed to sell and say. And so.
Right, it's a supplement. And they're super vague on their descriptions.
Yeah, exactly. And the problem for them with that is, so Elysium is trying to be a science-based company and run trials and have evidence and so forth. But they're competing against people who don't necessarily want to do any of that. So they're kind of spending some of their resources on being scientific, but someone else with a different supplement, if they're a better salesperson, they can just come and make things up and say things that aren't true. And then, most people won't know what's true and what's not true. So that's one reason why most of the companies in the longevity space are focused on making FDA approved or whatever country they're in approved therapies for specific diseases. Because when you then go that route, you run into the challenge that quote unquote aging isn't a thing that you can treat. You can't get a drug approved for just that. It has to be targeted at specific diseases.
So maybe we can talk about a little bit like what are the main approaches that people are developing their drugs. Like we talk about Altos Lab, they're doing reprogramming, right? There's some other ways to accomplish the goal. So maybe you can give us a little like a rundown, like what are the main approaches?
Yeah, to hopefully accomplish the goal. So in terms of therapeutic approaches, I would say the earlier, it kind of follows on what happened in the research field of aging, but, like 1 decade later. So the earliest approaches, which still exist, have focused on biology around sensing of nutrients. So there's especially two pathways, the insulin sensing pathway and what's called the mTOR pathway, which senses protein. We found in the animals that when you perturb those pathways, you can make the animals live longer. And so there are drugs that are trying to target that kind of biology. Maybe the best known is called rapamycin, which targets mTOR. In fact, mTOR stands for mammalian target of rapamycin. So the protein was found to be the target of the drug. And rapamycin is an improved drug for immunosuppression during transplants. But when you give it to old mice, they live significantly longer. And so there are some companies that are trying to make sort of variants of that kind of biology to improve aging. There were some companies focused on telomeres. Telomeres is doesn't actually seem to be that important for aging. I'm probably, insulting some people here, but certainly at one point they was considered just the big thing. Now it seems more like they play some role, but it's not like an answer to everything. Instead, one thing that has become a very interesting topic since the 2010s is the idea of senescent cells. And so these are cells in your body. You could think of them as like grumpy retired cells. It's any cell in your body can turn into this state. And it kind of stops doing what it's normally doing, enlarges a bit, and then sits there and spits out various signals, including inflammation molecules. And that seems to be bad for you in a variety of ways, causing accelerated aging of different tissues. And so Unity, which we talked about before, was, I think, the first company to try to find small molecule drugs that kill senescent cells specifically, but leave normal cells alone. And they started, I think it was in 2012. And since then, there's, 24 other companies that are trying to kill senescent cells. So that has been a popular approach. And then much more recently is this partial reprogramming that you mentioned, that Altos is focusing on. This is, we should probably have a whole thing on that. It's an interesting approach where you're trying to basically harness developmental biology and the biology that your body normally does to turn cells into not a younger state, but a more embryo-like state. Turn yourself kind of like into an egg again, almost. That's how you can visualize it. It's not strictly what's happening. And there were a couple of papers in 2016 and another one in 2021 that showed that if you do this, but you don't totally reverse your cell state, you just do it partially, it seemed to reverse various features of aging. And so that's a new topic that's still very fresh, let's say. There are a lot of kinks to iron out. There's a lot of sort of how well does this really work? It's in the experimental stage.
Which of these approaches are more like advanced or like kind of closer to the market? Can we say that?
Yeah. So there have been clinical trials, phase 2 clinical trials on variants of rapamycin. Senescent cells, so Unity had a clinical trial, phase 2, for osteoarthritis, which failed a couple of years ago. But still, they're now trying to push some eye drugs, and there are other companies doing senescent cells. So I would guess that within the next, 5 years, there's going to be some version of rapamycin and some version of senescent cell killing that's looking good in clinical trials. The reprogramming stuff is going to be more than 10 years before anything's happening. You could also say that we already have the first stuff on the market if you believe that, rapamycin is already an approved drug. There's another compound called metformin, which is a drug given to type 2 diabetics.
For diabetes, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's already, lots of people are taking that if you have diabetes. And there's some data from animal models that aside from having a positive effect on diabetes, it also may have a general positive effect on aging. Now, this hasn't been sort of proven in clinical trial in humans yet. There are people who are trying something called the TAME trial, TAME, where they're trying to test metformin just for diabetes. And they've been trying to get funding for that trial for a while.
I heard that people in the anti-aging space, and they're all taking that. Is that true?
Not all, but
all.
Some people are, yes. There's a range of sort of like how adventurous, again, you are. I think for all of these things, we have to remember that until you've tested, like biology is tricky. If something works one way in one context in biology, it works differently in a different context. And nothing is really, it's not like a one-dimensional good on one end and bad on the other end, and you just got to get more and more good stuff and like avoid bad stuff. It all depends on your specific genetics and what else is going on in your life. For instance, if you go on a diet, for most people on average, that's probably good. If you're overweight, that's definitely good. If you are underweight, then it's bad for you, right? Like exercise, it's definitely good for you in almost all circumstances. But if you're out of food and you're sort of walking through the desert, you shouldn't be doing push-ups. So everything depends on, the situation you're in. And the same is true for these drugs, that they've been tested in animals that are in a very controlled environment. And we need to know what they do in humans, and will they work in some people or in all people, and so forth. So until those things have been tested directly, we don't know for sure. And then the question that faces all these people in the aging field, should you take metformin anyway? Which comes down to, do you think that like the odds are in your favor? Do you think that there's a better chance that it does something good than that it does something bad for you? And for metformin, for instance, I think one reason that one is popular is that, tens or hundreds of thousands of diabetics have been taking it for a long time. So we're pretty sure that there are not sort of serious negative effects. So the odds of it being good don't have to be as high as, some other thing that might have horrible side effects.
Yeah, I know this space, there's a lot of scientists and they're doing a lot of like hacks on themselves. Like this article I was reading, the CEO of BioViVa, Liz Parrish, yeah, she's been injecting herself with just like cocktail virus and gene for years. And she does look young. Right? She just like kind of doing that on herself, like, treat herself like a patient zero. Is that like a normal in this space?
And especially, I would say the people who go to that degree of sort of biohacking, I don't know what your definition of scientist is, but if it's like I work at a research lab at a university and I have a PhD, that tends to not be the people who go for the sort of extreme experimental stuff. There are some people, I think it's mostly what gets covered in the news and in the media and so forth, right? Obviously, the most extreme cases are what gets covered, but 95% of people at the Buck Institute or the National Institute on Aging or a place like that, like aren't doing anything that not like everyone in the country is doing.
So in terms of like the capital, so are there a lot of VCs interested in this space right now, or mostly just from like private family offices or like just individual rich people?
There's interest from both of those. There are some VCs that are specifically focused on longevity things. So just sort of going off the top of my head, there's Longevity Fund, which is here in San Francisco, Laura Deming. There's Juvenescence, which is based in the UK. There's Longevity Vision Fund. There's Apollo in Germany. There's Kisu in Germany. 2 or 3 more called some variant of longevity. So there are a number of VC funds that are specifically focused on aging biology. And then there are also plenty of sort of biotech funds that are interested in longevity. Unity was VC behind that was Arch Ventures, which is a very well-known biotech VC here in the US. So they clearly had some interest there. Yeah, and Andreessen Horowitz has invested in longevity companies, General Catalyst. Some of the sort of Silicon Valley biotech interested funds are also focused on that, as well as obviously specific family offices.
Yeah, because I was curious because normally their return cycle is like 8-10 years. That's probably not going to cover the whole cycle of a drug development for especially a frontier space like anti-aging. So when in terms of like their strategy, I would just like, why are they investing in this space? Because it's definitely going to take longer for their return.
Yeah, for sure. But you have to remember also that liquidity event for the VCs typically comes much before there's an actual drug approval. So the majority of biotech companies that succeed or that don't fail, let's say, their fate is to be bought by a pharma company somewhere around like phase 1, maybe phase 2 clinical trials. And so at that point, the VCs get their returns. Another path is that the company goes public, at which point, again, the VCs can cash out regardless of what happens later. In the market right now, you're seeing companies go public, sometimes even before they've started clinical trials, which is much earlier than it used to be. So I guess that's, I'm not a VC, but I think that's what's happening is that they don't need to see, most of the VCs aren't investing in the company hoping to go all the way to drug approval.
Right, because we did an episode about psychedelic, because there were some psychedelic company went IPO for the past year.
Yeah, Compass, for instance.
Right, so they just they're not that far ahead in clinical trial, but they still went public. But in terms of the space in anti-aging, there are company like Unity and some other company, but the stock market is not looking really kind of buy-in. So for example, Unity, when they went public in 2018, share price is 16.75, and now it's $2.96, kind of a significant drop. Why is that?
Well, for Unity, that's very simple. And I think this is the general answer, is that Unity had a phase 2 trial fail. Biotech companies rest a lot on their first program and maybe their second program. And so Unity had their flagship program in osteoarthritis fail phase 2 clinical trials. And at that point, their stock just totally tanked. So secondary markets, they generally look at how are you doing in the clinic? And every little piece of evidence for or against is, it's going to affect your share price. For Unity, they're going to have a tough time coming back from that failure. They have one more program running. If that doesn't work well, my guess is the company is going to cease to exist.
Do you think that will affect the whole anti-aging space?
Doesn't seem to. I have that thought of the first companies kind of have to succeed, but it's normal that biotech companies fail clinical trials. That's not what you want, of course, but most clinical trials don't succeed through phase 3. Most drugs don't work. So in the same way that most tech startups, don't become Google or anything. So I think it's kind of understood. It's not indicative of the aging field. It's normal for biotech in general that many things end up not working.
What about other company that already went public, like Frequency or Cobar, Ajax, those companies?
Yeah, Cobar, also just does the stuff work or not? In the secondary market, it's just all about, can you prove in a clinical trial that your thing works, and can you get to revenue, which is usually in the form of drug approval. There is considerable revenue that can be accrued from having partnerships with larger pharma companies, but all of that stuff, I don't think it's a meta view on longevity companies in any sense. It's just do they have stuff that's getting close to approval or that looks really promising in late stage clinical trials? And they don't. So then the share price is low. If you go to sort of biotech companies and look at their share price over time, you're going to see these extreme jumps, 3x or 4x from day to day. That's when they announce their clinical trial results, and that's when it went well. And when it doesn't go well, you see the same thing.
But they don't have many chances, right? If you have 1, 2 fails, and probably the company, just like you said, cease to exist.
Most biotech companies are centered around either one asset, so one sort of drug candidate, or maybe a class of drug candidates, but that are very similar to each other, and therefore they're quite correlated in outcomes. And yeah, when it doesn't work, often the company becomes kind of like a zombie company. Maybe they're still technically alive, but nobody is very bullish on them. And there's a chance that they can miraculously pull off a comeback, but usually that doesn't happen. Nowadays, there's companies like Gordian are different in that they're what's often called platform companies. So instead of being centered around a specific type of biology with one or more assets, the way Unity is, there's basically, we're going to kill senescent cells. We have these 2 molecules. we are focused on a platform that can discover new therapeutics. So we've built a technology platform that isn't limited to just like a single asset, but is hopefully much better at identifying assets that work than other approaches. And so that type of company, I think, will have a better ability to weather the failure of any single drug. And with the right investors, there's a bit more patience. They're sort of the same as what you see in tech, that, okay, it's okay that you're not succeeding yet because you're growing and growing and growing. And by the time you start cashing in, it's going to be a really big deal. And so that type of company is not new per se. You could say that like the first biotech company, Genentech, was a platform company because they just had a way to make new protein drugs. They didn't have a specific single asset. But then there was an interim phase where platforms wasn't really the focus. And now they're starting to come back again in the last, I don't know, it's hard to put dates on things, but let's say a decade.
So you're selling to other people who are also developing anti-aging drugs because you're the platform.
No, not necessarily. So it can be that you are selling your services to other companies. There are some companies that do that. Let's say Atomwise, they're some sort of AI drug development or drug design company. And so their business model seems to be to make deals with lots and lots of other companies and then take small ownership of each of those drugs. The dynamics of biotech are such that there are sort of specific value inflection points where once you have just like a target for a disease, for like how to treat a disease, that's not really worth much. Then once you've shown in an animal that it actually reverses the biology that you say it will, then it becomes worth like a lot more. 10x or more. And then once you have any kind of positive data in a human, then you have another value inflection point. And so things aren't really like the gold standard is, does it cure an animal of some model of your disease? Before that happens, it's not worth a lot. And so if you try to go really, really broad and just partner everything with other people, your sort of cost of goods, your ability to generate a new thing has to be really, really low before you can make a lot of money there. What ends up happening with most companies, even if they start out trying to do that thing, is that they eventually decide that they want to have more ownership in the drugs that are coming out of their platform. And so they become like Genentech or like Moderna, they become a company that has a broader portfolio of things that they're trying. Sometimes with interesting business structures where it's kind of spinning out assets as independent companies, sometimes not, but still going broad, but trying to own the drugs themselves. And that's also what Gordian does. Like we are a drug development company. Our business model is the same as Genentech.
Got it. You can do it on the same trajectory. And then once you have the platform, that's kind of also a business model. And then you can also develop your own drugs.
Yeah, the platform makes you more robust, right? It means that if one thing fails, not everything else, all the value in your company is tied up with that thing. The other reason you do a platform, well, at least for Gordian, the technology we've built is something that allows us to test dramatically more things in animal models of disease than other companies are able to. And that's because of what I told you before. Testing it, what's called in vivo, in a living creature, is really where the first time that you start having high confidence in whatever asset you have. And so we've decided to take that point and really parallelize how much we can do at that stage. Not only because that makes us more robust, but also because we can map out every possible drug that you can imagine for a disease and then pick the one that has the best profile in vivo and move forward with that one into clinical trials. Because clinical trials are really expensive. So once you commit to one target or one asset and start moving it into clinical trial, you're locked in for like hundreds of millions of dollars. And so you really want to know, do I have the best one beforehand?
For example, like Google's Calico, like what are they doing? Because Google has like really deep pocket. Do you think that's like kind of like a good model too? It just like rely on a big company and then basically you are just good for a long time instead of going public or like raising rounds and rounds of money.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine there are pros and cons. The pro is that you don't have to get distracted with like, what do investors want right now, or what does the market want right now, and you can maintain a long-term vision. The con is that you don't have, in the same way that a startup does, sort of the fear of death, sort of Damocles constantly hovering over you. And
They're not working as hard.
Maybe. Calico is pretty secretive, so it's not clear everything they're doing. It is clear that they're doing both research that's very basic, just understanding how different aging processes work, basically like academia, not dissimilar to what happens at the Buck. And they're doing some drug development, mostly with drugs that they've licensed in from other universities and things like that. Some of the things they're working on seem to be aging, but they also have a portfolio that's honestly just kind of cancer drugs. So, of course, cancer is a disease of aging, but it's not really clear how that balance is going to be moving forward. And then they say they're doing various types of technology development. But overall, they haven't been doing a ton of publishing, and they haven't started a lot of sort of high-profile trials. So it's hard to say what exactly Calico is planning to do. Presumably something very, long-term, since they have all that money.
We talk about for drugs like rapamycin and senolytics. So those are going to be shorter term. We're going to see they're going to come onto the market. And then reprogramming and other stuff are longer term. So for example, like what's the hardest obstacle in terms of developing these drugs? Is there still clinical trials, or is just some scientific theory that's not proven yet?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know how aging works. We can just say that right away. We know a lot of things about how aging works, but it's not like we have a complete map of everything that's happening. And therefore, we know exactly what to do. So when someone goes and develops drugs for senolytics, it's because there's a lot of evidence that senolytics play some role in the aging process. And therefore, they have some tie to diseases of aging, but they're not playing the entire role of what's driving aging. And so you are taking a bet that for this disease, killing senescent cells or removing them in some way, it's going to have a big enough effect on the average patient, some of whom might have developed the disease one way, some of whom might have developed the disease a different way, that you're going to pick up a signal in the clinical trials. And so that's true for all drug development, but it's at least as true for aging. And for aging, there is one big challenge, which is that most of the basic research that happen focuses on lifespan and making, mice live longer, things like that. But when you get to the clinical trial stage, you have to go after one specific disease. And so there's a gap there where you take your aging drug and then you have to decide which disease do we go after. And so Unity, for instance, did a lot of work on different lung diseases, eye diseases, osteoarthritis, probably others, to figure out where do we think it's most likely that this drug on this one disease is going to have an effect. And that gap, well, it is certainly making it a lot harder for biotech companies to go after aging mechanisms, because the whole premise of the aging field is that these mechanisms of aging are connected to many different diseases. And so if you were measuring sort of a panoply of diseases and you were doing that over a longer period of time, then you should see an effect. That's what you were doing in the lab, right? We're feeding some drug, and then over time, you see less incidence of diseases. But that's not how clinical trials are designed for the most part. They're designed as you have this disease, and we're trying to reverse it, and we're only looking at one single disease. And so that's a barrier, and a better understanding of exactly how do the biological mechanisms map to the manifestation of specific diseases would be very helpful for the field. The other big thing that's missing is biomarkers, which is ways of measuring what's happening biologically in a snapshot. And so, for example, blood pressure or cholesterol are biomarkers of heart disease, because we've shown over decades of work that if you have higher blood pressure, you have a higher risk of heart disease. What the field really needs is human biomarkers of aging that predict the incidence of multiple diseases. They can kind of tell you how biologically old you are, because not only can you then measure those directly in clinical trials and hopefully get an insight into multiple diseases and what your risk of multiple diseases are, but also you can do it a lot faster, right? Like to run a typical aging experiment the way we do in the lab in a clinical trial, you'd have to start giving people a drug when they're 40 and then follow them for 40 years. We can't do that, right? It's impossible.
Right.
So what we really need is some way to measure right now what's going to happen to you over the next 40 years. And so that's a really interesting topic in the field of sort of aging research.
Now we know it's like we want to lengthen our telomerase. So we know that's one of the, it gets shortened and then we have like less lifespan. So are we just barely scratching, like scratching the surface of like aging science, or like how much we know about?
It's hard to say, right? Like I can tell you that one of the known unknowns is we have, depending on how you slice it, but let's say a dozen different types of biology that seems important for the aging process. So we know that there are these various things. Within each of them, we certainly don't know everything. We probably know less than half of what there is to know about this type of biology. But maybe more importantly, we don't really know the relationships between these things. We know that short telomeres can cause senescent cells, but in your actual body, how often does senescence result from short telomeres versus something else? Like, what are the relationships between these different biological mechanisms? Are there some that we should target because those are upstream of many other things that are happening? This is a known unknown. Like, we know that it would be important to figure that out, and we haven't been able to yet. We're just sort of slowly chipping away at it. But then the unknown unknowns, like, what don't we even know about aging? That's obviously very hard to say. I guess my guess is, and this is definitely a guess, is that with everything we know now, as I mentioned, we'll be able to develop drugs over the next, develop them over the next 5 to or less than 10 years. And then you have to run through clinical trials that do something for aging processes and kind of show that they work over the next less than 20 years. And that's going to improve health in a broad way, but also in a limited way. You're talking about, let's say, just guessing, 20% reduction of incidence of these different diseases, something on that scale, not more than that, which is going to be huge, right? Like the economic impact and the personal sort of subjective impact of that would be absolutely massive and easily the biggest thing we can do for human health other than eradicating all infectious diseases, right? So certainly we should do that. When are we going to get like something that just totally blows your mind and, take someone who looks old to live to 180, or take a really old and wrinkled person and they just really become young? I don't really want to guess, but probably not in the next 20 years. Probably what's going to happen first is that we're going to do that to some animals, maybe to like people's pets, like dogs and cats. There's some companies going after that kind of thing, which regardless of like the market for that as a consumer sales and all that kind of stuff, if you just take someone's dog and make it live to like 25, people are going to be like, oh, wow.
Yeah, a lot of people will buy it. All right, yeah.
Can I have some of that? Right?
Definitely.
So I think that kind of thing will probably be a catalyst for the field, again, within the next 20 years. That's then going to like spur a lot more focus. Because, the reason I spend time on biology of aging, it's worth dedicating my life to that, is that you look at a graph of the incidence of most of the diseases that you're worried about getting, like Alzheimer's and cancer and heart attacks, and it just goes up like pretty much exponentially with age. So there's something going on. There is some underlying biology that's making you vulnerable to all these things when you get old. And we've shown, in the worms and in the mice and so forth, that underlying biology is something you can modulate. And so, there's a lot of work to do to get it to actually work reliably in humans. But doing that is the biggest lever we have on human health.
So can I ask you, what's your personal routine to keep usefulness?
Sadly, it's like most of the stuff that's going to make you live longer, you already know it's going to make you live longer.
Just exercising.
Exercise, don't smoke, eat less sugar, eat more vegetables, all those kinds of things, right? So I did do... So there's something called intermittent fasting, which now means all kinds of things. The aging experiments that were done, it typically means like eating every other day. Or if you're a mouse, it means eating every other day. And so I did that during my PhD and part of my postdoc for 4 years total, just because it seemed to, in animals, it seems to make them live longer. Now, more recently, we figured out that how much you want to be fasting and these kinds of things depends on the genetics of the animals. And so what's sort of the right, quote unquote, dose of fasting in humans? We definitely don't know that. That's part of the reason I'm not keeping it up. The other part of the reason I'm not keeping it up is the same as the Elysium pills, right? Like you feel nothing's different.
Right.
And so you can maintain it. And then when you get super busy, for instance, if you're running a startup, then you kind of just like, it's easy to put it aside because you feel nothing changing when you do that.
I used to have a coworker and he does this fasting every 6 months or so. And then he does this maple syrup with cayenne pepper thing. So he will be drinking that for a week. And then I think for the last couple of days of that week, I can clearly see that his brain is like super slow and it's just not working. But it's kind of like a trendy thing in the Valley still, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, things come and go, whether it's like ice baths or intermittent fasting.
Right, the cryo chamber, you can just,
Yeah, exactly. And usually there's some kind of evidence that, in some kind of study, either doing that to humans had maybe some effect on some markers that might be indicative of health, or, you did it to some mice and it helped them. And so there's often some kind of science behind it. But like I said early in the episode, biology is really tricky. Because something works in a certain way in one context doesn't mean it works in the same way in a different context. If mice live longer when they eat every other day, does that mean humans live longer when they eat every other day? Or is it because like mouse metabolism is faster, humans are supposed to be like 5 days on, 5 days off or something else? Like we just don't know.
Nothing's conclusive, yeah.
That's why we need biomarkers.
I don't think I have more questions. Do you have anything you want to add?
I guess I would just sum things up as like, we know a lot and we know this can work and we know there's a lot to figure out and we need to just do the important work, answer the important questions. I recently launched a grants program where we give sort of academic grants to researchers to focus on the many things that we just don't know yet. Instead of getting too caught up on like whatever is the latest and greatest thing, like this is going to be the silver bullet, this is going to answer everything. Like, let's get biomarkers. Let's get ways of measuring whether things are working. Like, let's understand the context dependence of the biology we have. Like, there is a diamond mine there. And I think we should focus on getting to that as fast as we can. Like, I'm not like complacent, like, oh, we just need to do more research. It's going to take infinity. Like, we should go as fast as we can towards that, but not try to jump all the hurdles and just assume that something is definitely going to work before we know that that's true.
Got it. It's more like Edison still trying different material for the light bulb, but we have more better tools, better computer, better AI to help us to achieve faster.
Yeah, look at AI, right? Like neural nets is not like some miracle. It's like you have enough compute to do it, as my limited understanding of the field, right? But like there's a lot of infrastructure that makes all the amazing stuff happen.
Cool. Thank you so much, Martin, for joining us. Yeah, I learned a lot and it was fun.
Cool. Yeah, ditto.
这期 What's Next 科技早知道就到这里了。听完之后，如果你有任何的想法，欢迎在评论区里面给我们留言，我们每一条都会认真的看。如果你喜欢我们的节目，请记得给我们5星或者好评，分享给更多的朋友，也会对我们非常有帮助。你也可以单独写邮件给我，邮箱地址是ting@声.fm， 我都会一一回复。那同时公众号和微博也可以搜索生动活泼，声是声音的声，节目相关的更多信息会在公众号里出现，微博和公众号都会有不定期的福利给到大家。如果你想要跟我们更加紧密的讨论和分享，或者是想要认识和你一样有求知欲的新朋友，可以加入我们的微信群。进入听众群的方法是在公众号文章中扫码添加，或者是公众号后台回复科技早知道即可获取邀请码。期待你的加入，我们下期见。